The All In podcast is brought to you by the Urban League of Metropolitan St. Louis in partnership with the National Urban League, the National Action Network, Shea Moisture, and the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation.
So I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And really what that allowed me to do is help people in a way where I could diagnose and treat. And that was really what I really love to do. We've seen an increase in people's mental health, as far as just saying, I'm struggling, I need support. We're looking at something of about 45% of adult individuals are saying, yes, my mental health has been affected in some way or another due to the pandemic. When we start to feel down, when we feel quite not like ourselves, it's important to recognize that and to say, something's different. Let me think about what that is.
And welcome to another edition of the All In podcast. I'm your host, Pat Washington. Thank you for joining us today. We are all in against COVID, and we want you to be too. Today, take a deep breath with me. We're going to talk about our mental health, mental wellness, and how COVID really impacted us all. It was, I don't even know how to describe it. There are folks who are still, including me, who are still just traumatized by just the word pandemic. So today we're going to talk about COVID-19. We're going to talk about your mental health and wellness and talk about how COVID-19 and even as the pandemic is winding down, how we can take better care of ourselves and how we can pay attention to our mental health and wellness just as we do our physical health and wellness. So I'm pleased to be joined by Candace Hamell. She is the Associate Director for Child and Young Adult Services at BJC Behavioral Health. And she has been kind enough to join us and kind of help us gain some insights and some understanding. And so we're just going to have a great conversation, take plenty of notes, and we'll have links to her office and to BJC Behavioral Health in the podcast and on the page. So I keep wanting to say Dr. Hamell, but Candace, welcome to the All In podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about you, and then if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about BJC Behavioral Health and what you do there.
Sure. So a little bit about me. I like to say I'm a person that likes to be involved, naturally social worker, I think, at heart. And so early as a little girl, I really wanted to be a medical doctor. And I think the reasoning behind that was I really wanted to help people who couldn't help themselves. And so throughout schooling, as I went through undergraduate and graduate, my education, I realized it was really more about the mental health and the mind more so than the actual physiological and physical health aspects. And so I said, well, maybe I need to go and get a MSW. And so I went ahead and finished school and got my master in social work and became licensed. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And really what that allowed me to do is help people in a way where I could diagnose and treat. And that was really what I really love to do. And so as I thought about my little girl self, it was more about I wanted to know, how's your family? What's going on with your friends? And how's your relationships? And are you taking good care of your parents? So it wasn't so much, oh, you have a cold, let me prescribe this medicine. It was more about making sure as a whole, holistically we were together. And so that's kind of how I got into my career and have been at BJC about 15 years. There I serve as one of our leaders and lead and direct our child and young adult departments. And really what that entails is being able to not only ensure that we have enough staffing and leaders to do the work, but also that our clients really receive the services as needed. And I think what really initially attracted me to children and youth was the fact that I knew that maybe I could change someone who was 12 years old and help them have a different trajectory of life versus someone who was 60 or 70. And so that was really how that love came about. I wanted to work with early childhood, young preschool age children as well as young adults. And the young adults are really tricky, and I'm sure we'll talk about them more in depth at some point. But it was they have their whole life ahead of them. At least that's what people who are older than we, of us, we think that. And they don't always think that. And so I wanted to be able to give them a different outlook. So initially I was in direct practice, so I saw clients every day and that sort of thing. And over time, I realized I really could affect change differently and be on a more macro level. And so I got into operational management and really have loved and enjoyed this work over the last 10 years. And so BJC Behavioral Health is funded by the Department of Mental Health, and so we serve as we consider them to be socially, emotionally disturbed children and adolescents, as well as adults. And so all of our clients have some sort of mental health concern, and typically are working with a therapist and or psychiatrist, whether they're being prescribed medication and or some kind of therapy and counseling. And really they are needing supports in lots of different areas, whether it is mental health and housing or school and or job and or something of that sort. And so at our organization, we really help those that are either uninsured or underinsured and those that really need us. And so we are really the catchment area of St. Louis City and County. And people come to us when they need help. And so there's a lot of different ways to access our services. Typically, people will call our access center or walk into our same day access clinics. We have several different locations across the city and county, but really, we're here to work with them and develop a plan of what are your needs? What do you see? What do you hope for? Where are you struggling? And then allow them and connect them to resources in order to do so. So it's really great work and something that I hold really true and dear to my heart.
I can imagine it must be very rewarding.
It is.
We're going to focus a little bit today on COVID, but I do want to talk more broadly about the work that you're doing because I don't feel like there are enough resources. That's a really fragile population and probably more than most people know. And so I just applaud you for the work you're doing. The All In podcast, we look at COVID's impact, not just from the physical standpoint, but I wanted to talk specifically about the mental health, the mental wellness aspects. Um, what does something like a pandemic or something like COVID that isolated people, or given the population that you just talked to us about, already fragile, already have some issues, what does something like being in a lockdown or being in a pandemic mode, what kind of impact can that have on a person's mental health and well-being?
Man, I mean, when I think back to when we first heard reports of what was going on in the pandemic starting, I don't think we really knew what we were up against. And I think for most of us, it was, oh, we'll be at home for a couple weeks and we can resume as normal. And I remember hearing these words just amongst friends, family. And I quickly began to see that this wasn't something that was going to end. And I think that the mental aspects have impacted us so greatly that I don't think we even really imagine and continue to impact us. And I think that that's really important for us to think about because initially, people were just dying. And so I think the fear was what really, added a lot of stress and trauma to us just naturally because it was an unknown. We didn't know where the virus and how the virus and what was with the virus. I mean, there were so many questions that I think most of us had. And for those that, already had other, aspects, other things happening in their lives, it just heightened it, and as the stay home order started, you talk about isolation. I think naturally we as people we're expected to be together. There's a sense of belonging that we as people need. That's how we're created. That's how humans survive and how we thrive. And so to be at home for an extended period of time, it really weighed on most people, and it weighed on people differently. I remember joining a training. This was probably 8 or 9 months into the pandemic, but the presenter gave this analogy about we're all at sea, and some of us have these large, yachts and large sailboats. And some of us have these small paddle boats, and some of us have no paddle boats or no oars. And some of us are just in the water without anything. And so when she, gave that descriptor, I could really visually see, what some of our clients were going through, what some of our family and friends were going through, our communities were going through. And I think that we weren't, obviously prepared for this, but we have really, as I think over the last few years, worked together as a group of people to figure out how do we continue to survive, with what we're seeing and how things are going. And it's been tough, I think, for everybody. We've seen an increase in people's mental health, as far as just saying, I'm struggling, I need support. We're looking at something of about 45% of adult individuals are saying, yes, my mental health has been affected in some way or another due to the pandemic. And I think for younger individuals, those around 18 to 29 or 30, they're looking at something like 67, 69%, because that isolation has taken them away from their natural ways to connect, school and
Oh, wow.
work and,
Yes.
all of those things. And so outside of just the death toll that we have seen across, our country and our world, it's the isolation piece that I feel like has really eaten people probably, from the inside out of not being able to socialize that we, have known to do in the past. So it's definitely a huge impact.
Well, I think so, what you just said about especially that younger group, for them connection was even more important in their lives, whether
Absolutely,
they were in
absolutely.
social media, their social groups, their outings, the things that put them together, whether it was sports or school, everything, they were together. And then to just not be able to do that, what kinds of things are you observing as a professional, and what is that isolation or that just abrupt change in a lifestyle? What does that cause? What kinds of things did you see?
Well, some of the things that I've seen that I feel like have been very apparent is naturally I feel like young people and and adults both, we have it's really weighed on people's ability to cope. And so I've seen that probably be one of the number one factors is my usual outlets for socialization, for stress relief, for peace, whatever you want to call it, has changed. And so for those who are used to being connected spiritually, if I can't go to church every week or go to the synagogue or however I choose to practice, that has weighed on me. If I'm used to going to the gym and working out and having a stress reliever from a physical standpoint, and now I can't because they're closed or I don't feel safe or I don't feel comfortable, that's huge. For people who are living in congregate settings, I can't get away. If I'm living next to people and I don't know their whereabouts, that's causing fear and anxiety. So there's so many examples that I think about. And particularly within our work, what we've seen is just fearfulness. I'm worried about how I'm going to get from A to B, whatever A to B might look like. So if it's a loss of a job, if it's, caring for loved ones, and I want to make sure that I protect my own self, but then also protect my elderly grandparents if I care for them. Or I'm worried about my children now that they're at home. I can't do my regular job because I have to care for them and find a way to make ends meet. And so we've seen a lot of that over the last, several years with different situations. And I think anybody you ask, they can come up with something that has changed, in relation or due to the pandemic for sure.
Is there any particular group that's more impacted than another? Male, female, younger, older,
I think it
anything?
depends on what you're looking at. I think definitely yes. So, when you look at marginalized communities, you look at Black and Brown communities, they definitely disproportionately have been impacted at a higher rate than some of our white counterparts. But then we also think about gender, you think about socioeconomic status. So, those are definitely demographics that have impacted this. For those that are frontline workers, and those are typically, people who are in the food industry or retail industry, or people who are nurses, doctors that have no choice to work from home or to have a remote work. They have to be in person, and so that's going to weigh on their mental health because they're like, I'm caring for other people, but also I know I need to make ends meet. And then I know I had mentioned before about congregate settings, those that are living in residential care facilities or nursing homes, like all those things impact my day-to-day functioning if I'm worried about a airborne virus or illness that is impacting our world. So yes, definitely.
I think I've heard you use the word fear a couple of times, and it's real. I mean, the fear is tangible and about so many different things. So, how are people coping? What are they turning to? Hopefully, they'll come to BJC and get some tips on how to maintain their mental health and wellness. But what do you find people doing if they didn't have access to the things that they were used to? But now it seems like things are a little bit better. We're back outside, as people say.
as people say,
So
right?
yeah.
I think it depends on what their typical outlets were before and if they even had the means to have them. And so I think for, certain groups, they've had to be creative. I know initially everyone wanted to have Zoom calls, family Zoom calls, friend Zoom calls, happy hour Zoom calls, those sorts of things. And so we quickly turned to technology as a way to stay connected, to be socially, close but distant or apart. And I think that that's a luxury for some. Everyone doesn't have those means. And so I think early on, what we were sharing with clients and friends and family, if you have the ability to take a walk, take a walk. If you have the ability to step outside on your porch, step outside on your porch. If you have any kind of stairs, go up and down your stairs to get some kind of exercise. But then also, I think you have to be honest about where you are and what your needs are. And so I think we can't really meet our needs if we don't know what those are. And so a lot of people, it's like, stress is a big thing. And we know that a lot of people have been stressed and continue to be due to the pandemic and what the pandemic has caused. And so it's remembering to eat a balanced diet if you can. It's remembering to drink water. It's remembering to take breaks. It's remembering to, if you have time away from work, to do so. It's remembering to get enough rest. So there's some things that naturally we should always be doing, but it's much harder to remember to do those things when your mind is constant of, anxiety or fear or depression or whatever it might look like. And it doesn't have to be something that's diagnosable, but it could just be, this is how I feel right now. I haven't been able to sleep because I can't turn my mind off, or I feel like I'm eating crazy because this is how I handle stress and I stress eat or things like that. And so those are just
That
natural
would be me. I'm
conversations.
raising my
That's
hand on
me.
that one.
Uh-huh. That's
Yeah.
me too.
I've
So I
got
have
that.
to remember that, and I think it's all about balance. I think it's about moderation. I think it's about knowing yourself and being able to say, how do I balance what my needs are versus what I have in front of me? A lot of it is, come up with a new way of your daily routine. So what I did before, I no longer can do for whatever the reasonings are. So what does that look like? What does your nighttime routine look like? I think for parents and caregivers, you have to be honest with your children. You have to say, here's how mommy or daddy or whoever is feeling, and why. And it has to be age appropriate, which is a lot of things that we talk with our parents about. But I think we owe it to our young people to share with them how we're feeling so they know how to process their own feelings. And so if we pretend that we don't have any of these feelings, then how do they know that what they're feeling is real? I'm used to going to school and now I'm at home every day. I don't know how to process that. And so there's lots of things, but I think those initial pieces that I mentioned are, a start for those that are like, I don't know anything. Where do I start? Start with making sure you're drinking enough water, making sure that you're having some kind of vegetable or fruit if you can. And it can be any kind of canned fruit, anything. It doesn't have to necessarily be something that's super expensive, but trying to incorporate some of those things into your daily routine is really important.
Well, as I'm listening to you talk and chalking up how many of those things I'm guilty of, not getting enough sleep, the stress eating. I got my bag of chips over there behind the camera right now. All of those things that we may not realize actually have an impact on our mental health and well-being. I know
Absolutely.
I've changed my whole sleep routine. I was one of those people that had the laptop over here, the phone over here, there were lights on. So I've learned to create a different routine for just going to bed and getting
Hmm.
rest.
Absolutely. It makes a difference. I think when we all know that when we're well rested, you show up differently. You're not as irritable. You may not as be as cranky or tempered. You don't have those nagging headaches that you get sometimes if you don't have enough rest. If we're not as stressed, we don't have tension headaches. So there's definitely a correlation between physical and mental health. And I think outside of people who don't study or are not a part of these professions, you have to be honest. You have to talk with your friends and family, and you have to check in on people. And I know that one of the phrases my friends and I would use over this time is like, check on your strong friends. And
Yes.
that's really what you have to do because people are not going to always express. how they're feeling. One, sometimes they don't want to share, fear of being vulnerable or worry that someone will judge them or just being open and transparent. But then also, if you're worried about me and I'm worried about you, who's caring for us, right? And so that's also what we see with a lot of our healthcare workers. They expect us to be the strong people, and we all need support and need someone to check in on us. And so that's really important as well of being remembering sometimes it's just you pick up the phone and you say, hey, how are you doing? What's going on with you? So that's also a big thing.
So, do you think I keep trying to find something positive that has come out or can come out of this pandemic? But one of the things that I do believe is that people are talking more about, the need to care for their mental health, and they're being more open and candid. Are you seeing that?
Definitely seeing that. I think overall, the efforts that have been made to talk about suicide awareness, because we've seen an uptick in suicide with both adolescents as well as adults, to be able to talk about your mental health, to have providers that look and, can relate to you in some way has been important. Telehealth, I would say, is a huge plus. If we could have done it differently and not had a pandemic and then realize these things, absolutely. But telehealth is one of the rising ways to care for people, whether it's from a mental health standpoint or physical health. You can see your doctor over a screen and say, hey, I have this thing here, my symptoms, this is what it looks like, let me send in pictures, and still get treatment. And so those are some things that have really come out that have been a positive from the pandemic, as well as you mentioned connection, being able to have conversations more and talk about how people are feeling and what they're doing about it. I definitely see a positive in that. And I would say also we've learned to work differently. We've learned to live differently. And so some of the ways that we have worked have been very different. I think in person is very beneficial in some, professions you can't do your work without being in person, but for those that can do both, that hybrid approach has allowed people to reach colleagues and, different employees and things at a vastly different way just by being able to do any kind of virtual meetings. Whereas before, maybe I had to get on a plane to go meet my, connect wherever that might be in the US. Now I can do that over the phone. So it's reduced cost. A lot of, companies have reduced their infrastructure and their buildings just because they don't need them because people are working from home. So I think if nothing else, we have learned that we can do a lot of work without having to spend some of the resources that we've used to spending and being able to still get some of the same outcomes. So those are some positives, because of the pandemic.
I think it's so important to have those conversations, and I'm glad to see that even technology is making it easier for us to communicate, whether it's with friends or a therapist or whatever, because the stigma about mental health and mental wellness issues, that is real. We found that just going door to door with some of the COVID outreach in the community. There was concern, there was mistrust, there were just myths and just information that was just totally incorrect. And we found people who really did need someone to talk to, but they refused to say that they were depressed, or they refused to say that they were having anxiety, and it was like they didn't want anybody to realize that they were suffering. I mean, really suffering. Did you see that? And is that a reality? And how do we overcome it?
I think I saw that most in some of our personal spaces. I think at work, most of our clients already have acknowledged that they need other supports or need, additional supports from their mental health. So not as much, but I think that those that may have new mental health issues, they have been honest about those and transparent. But then also we have just seen an increase in the severity, I would say, of the mental health. And I think that's both, just in our communities as well as, for those that are doing this type of work. A lot more people, especially like in our school systems, the teachers are like, all the kids have anxiety. Why does everyone have anxiety? Well, because we've gone through a traumatic experience. And so for those that are like, oh, I've never had any trauma, this is a traumatic experience. What we've lived through, for those of us that have been fortunate enough to still be here, has been a huge traumatic experience. And the ways that our body and mind kind of compute that and take it in is different for everybody. Those that have already had any kind of pre-existing health conditions, whether whether it's, diabetes or high blood pressure or asthma or any of those things, anybody with any upper respiratory illnesses, all of that's going to impact how you feel right now living through, that kind of experience. And so maybe they're not diagnosable necessarily, mental health disorders, but everyone has mental health. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. So I think it's a continuum. And we've definitely seen that. And even when you talk with friends and family, people are like, I'm just stressed, I'm overwhelmed. And so you begin to pull back those layers and you realize that people are impacted. And they're impacted in a lot of variety of ways. And I also feel like people are impacted in ways that they didn't necessarily think could happen or really understand. And it's due to caring for loved ones, it's due to loss of loved ones, it's due to those that have had to change routines or change jobs or have had to figure out new ways to make money or any of those things. So I think all of us can say we've related in one way or another or know someone who has been directly or indirectly impacted for sure.
You're listening to the All In podcast. I'm your host, Pat Washington. We are joined today by Candace Hamell. She is the Associate Director of Child and Young Adult Services at BJC Behavioral Health. When we come back from this break, I want to talk a little bit about our young people and how they are coping and the strategies that they might be able to use, especially the little ones. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I think a lot of people were using the term pandemic babies, particularly those people that I know were pregnant during the pandemic or getting ready to deliver as the pandemic was happening. Very scary time, I think, for a lot of people, especially those that have young children. And so the children that have reoriented back into school and daycares and things like that, I think for a lot of them, when you talk about early childhood, we're looking at ages 3 to 7. So let's use that demographic. As you mentioned earlier, they don't know how to necessarily indicate or communicate how they're feeling. You have to do a lot of play therapy, I think, with them. And so even if you're not calling it that, we're utilizing crayons and books and tactile things and different sensory objects for them to continue to learn how to relax and how to de-stress. And so these aren't words that they understand, but their bodies feel that they understand. And that looks different for each child. It depends on what they've experienced and what they've gone through and how much they've been impacted. Have they lost a parent? Have they had to be cared for by someone else in their family, or have they had to move or things like that? So if we're looking at kids that maybe not have experienced those types of changes, it's really about checking in, having them understand their emotions, doing a lot of those emotion cards that they typically will teach in those environments anyway. But I think it's even more crucial right now to be able to have young people share and explain, what does sadness look like? What does anger look like? What does happiness look like? What does fear look like? What does worry look like? And so a lot of books have come out. And just like I said, other crayons, coloring, blocks, ways to be able to work with them. And so from a therapeutic lens, those therapists are gathering all those types of toys that they would naturally have, but using a lot of child directed play to allow kids to have an outlook. And so they might have barn animals, they might have families that they get to play with, they may have like I said, blocks or any other kind of instruments that allow them to just kind of work through their feelings through play. So that's really important. And I would say that that's something that we've definitely seen. Other children have been fearful just because all they know is masks, right? So those that have been born the last couple of years, that's all they see. So, the thought has been, well, what do I do when I don't have to wear a mask anymore? It's kind of been part of my outfit, as the adults have said at work, but for children, that might be the only thing they're used to seeing. And so reorienting them when it's safe, if they, are not going to wear a mask or wear a mask, that sort of thing. So I think it's a very delicate subject, and I think that our educators as well as our daycare centers have a lot of work ahead of them, as well as have done a lot of tremendous work on being able to care for our little people when they're out and keep them safe. That's really been the biggest thing. So outside of all the other viruses we normally see, flu and RSV and colds and things like that. And now we've added another layer. And so a lot of the work that they have partnered with, whether they've been working with the government or the CDC or anything like that, has really been able to make it possible for them to return to those environments so that parents can go to work. And I think that both have to happen simultaneously for us to move forward for sure.
I mean, I really just had a moment when you were talking because I'm thinking there were children born during the pandemic who don't know anything else. And they're
Anything
what, 3,
different.
maybe 4 years? Oh
Yep.
my goodness.
Yeah.
That is something when you really think about that, it's like it's amazing to me. Their lives, what they were born into and what they've been, the first 3, 4 years of their lives have been, have been defined, if you will, by what was happening during the pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah. And we know those are the most crucial years. That's, the stages of development. We know that, even in the womb, that's obviously most critical. But then outside of the womb, those first 3 years are very important for the next 60 years. And so, a lot of the work that we have done of making sure that people have the resource. I think the resources are what are important. How do I find the resources and can I access the resources are the two, biggest things that parents, have either asked about or have been thinking about with regard to their own children or those that are caring for others. So that is a big deal.
So we're going to wrap up, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to um, offer us a summary, provide us with information about how people can reach you, and if they want to learn more about the services offered at BJC, how can they do that?
Definitely. Well, I think overall the biggest thing I would like to take away or to give people is to listen to your body. That's huge. It's hugely important. It's been important before the pandemic, but even more so now. And to allow yourself, if you can, to rest. And that's hard, especially for people like myself. I'm always on the go, but when you listen to your body, you are able to anticipate things that may be coming that you can prevent, right? And so it's all about preventative measures. And I think even from a mental health standpoint, when we start to feel down, when we feel quite not like ourselves, it's important to recognize that and to say, oh, something's different. Let me think about what that is. And we don't know to do that if someone doesn't suggest it or say, hey, you might want to think about this or think about that. So that's really important in addition to what we talked about before with, balanced diet and meditation and having a daily routine, drinking enough water and eating well and all those things. And I think it's more important about moderation than it is getting it all right because we're not perfect. We're not going to get it all right every single day. And so I think you have to pick one thing to focus on and, get to a point where you can master that and then go on to the next thing. As far as BJC Behavioral Health, definitely I would suggest people to check out our website at bjcbehavioralhealth.org or bjc.org. And there's lots of resources, lots of providers, and information for our communities on how to access our resources, as well as information that definitely we want our community to know. And so those things are important to note. And then to know that it is okay to not only we all have mental health, but it is okay to acknowledge when we're struggling. It is okay to say, today I'm not doing well. And what does that mean for me? And I think that stigma is something that we continue to see in our communities across all demographics and all lines. But the more and more that we have these candid conversations and we're open about this, and the more people that we see in this field of work, then the more comfortable I think people are with saying, "Let me reach out and let me see if I can, receive some help." So that's also really important as well.
I've been really, I mean, I could talk to you about this all day, and I know we're going to cut it short, but I would love for you to feel like this is your home. This is a place where you can come. And if there's something that you want to share as it relates to community health and wellness, certainly you're welcome to come back and do that. So
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me. It's been a great discussion and, just getting a chance to share things that sometimes we don't naturally think about, especially if it's not in our line of work. So thank you so much for having me.
all right, that's going to do it. You're listening to the All In podcast. I'm Pat Washington. We are all in against COVID, and we want you to be too. You can bookmark and like the site and come back and visit us often. We are linked at ulstl.com, and we'll see you on the next episode of the All In podcast.